There was a really weird occurrence at my dad's house a few years ago. He awoke to the sound of dogs barking and realized the neighborhood dogs were barking at something that was moving parallel to the road outside his house. When his own dog started to bark, he went outside to see what was up. Across the street is pretty much all forest except a church that at the time was just a gravel lot. My dad was too far away to see anything, but in the dead of night, he could definitely hear the sound of something running at full tilt across the gravel. A few things freaked him out about this. Whatever it was definitely ran on 2 feet. Try having a dog run on gravel versus a human, and you can definitely tell the difference. And it was big. Both he and myself have witnessed large animals like bears and moose running through the underbush, and according to him, it sounded like it was of similar size to those creatures. It was easily running somewhere around 40 to 50 miles per hour in the clearing of the lot, and then it slowed down again as it went back into the woods. He was able to compare the speed because the road itself is 45 miles per hour limit, so it was going just as fast as a passing car. The final thing, its huffing and gasping was so loud he could hear it from his front door and was obviously not human. We looked online later to compare its sound to other animals, and it really didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard before. The freakiest part was the almost synchronous reactions all the dogs had. He's never heard dogs react like that before. Both him, my stepmom, my stepbrother, and several of our neighbors all account for hearing the strange barking from the dogs, but it was only my dad who heard what they were after. Nothing's happened like that since, and I've never personally witnessed anything like it. We do live on the border of the Cascade Mountain Range and are surrounded by park and federal land if you want to get an idea of where this took place. I got home from school one day and decided to play a game on my computer. During intermission in the game, I would talk in a group chat with a couple of my friends. We were just telling jokes and making each other laugh until I needed to use the restroom. I told them I would be right back and left my phone on the desk and didn't turn it off. When I returned, I noticed that some of the letters were being pressed even though no one was in the room with me. It wasn't words that were being typed, but random letters with the @ symbol spacing them out. To me, it didn't mean anything, so I asked my friends if they thought it meant something, but they were startled by it and didn't know what it meant either. I thought it was strange, but decided to ignore it. Later that night, when I decided to go to bed, I turned off my lamp and got under the sheets. My cat Portia was beside me, sound asleep. Just a few moments later, I heard what sounded like footsteps slowly creeping their way through the hallway and into my bedroom. Suddenly, they stopped right outside my doorway. I glanced up and expected to see my brother, but no one was in sight. From her dead sleep, Portia bolted up and stood at the end of my bed and stared into the hallway. I was confused, since she had never done that before. I tried to get her back to her normal spot on the bed, but she wouldn't budge. I even put my hand in front of her face, but she kept trying to peer over it. She eventually sat back down and went to bed, though. Since then, I haven't had any other experiences like that, and I still wonder if there was something trying to contact me that night. This happened nearly 10 years ago, because it was right before I found out I was pregnant with my 9-year-old daughter. This is going to be something that I'm pretty sure most won't believe. I actually don't really like remembering it, because it was very traumatic to me. The next day after it happened, I actually thought it was a nightmare. That was until my boyfriend said, "Hey, so what about all that yesterday evening, huh? What was that?" Then all of the horrific details came flooding back, and I knew it hadn't been a dream. I wasn't very pleased with my boyfriend, because his drinking had been in excess at the time, and he would get belligerent and embarrassing. I figured that I would give him a taste of his own medicine, and show him what it was like when I got that way. I had just taken my first shot of Crown Royal. We were just riding around waiting for a friend of his to get back home. I really didn't know the area, so I figured my boyfriend knew it was okay to ride into this wooded area. We pulled down this little dirt road into the woods, and as soon as we get out of sight of the road, something comes staggering out of the woods toward the car. I asked him, "Who is that? Do you know him?" I turned to him and see that he has a blank look on his face, like he had no idea what I was talking about. I look back around and bam! My side of the car is hit with such force that it's literally picked up off the ground. We were just in a little Honda Accord. This thing that had staggered out from the woods was like 8 or 9 foot tall. It looked like it had on platform-like boots, and its face was white and distorted, kind of like a mime. It looked like he had either white makeup or some kind of mask on. Either that, or its skin came farther off its head somehow, up over part of his hair. I've never even imagined anything looking like that before in my life. I at first thought that someone was maybe wearing some kind of Halloween costume that they had made or something, and I figured maybe my boyfriend knew him, because it was walking toward the car with purpose. It was like it was drunk or something. So it stumbles up my side of the car and hits it so hard it comes off the ground on that side. At this point, I'm tripping. My boyfriend couldn't see it at all, so that's why he had some blank look on his face. When that happened though, we were both in shock, and I was screaming. I immediately am trying to get away from this thing too, so I'm practically in my boyfriend's lap, but still expecting him to be able to put the car in reverse and get us out of there. The sunroof was open, and I see above me part of a black wing come through it, and on the very end of the wing there was this thick, huge claw-like thing. I'm now screaming for my boyfriend to get us out of there. This thing is swarming the car and its wing is flapping so fast I could feel the wind from it in the back of my head. Then I'm moving toward the driver's side floorboard, trying anything I can to get away from whatever it was. My boyfriend never does see any of it, but he knows we're getting attacked by something because the car is getting shook back and forth from the force of this thing. I'm screaming and crying for him to please, please, please get us out of there. Despite me being over on his side in a crazy way, he somehow gets the car in gear and starts trying to back out. Tires spinning, finally it either falls off or the car breaks whatever grip it had on us. At first, my boyfriend stops because it's obvious we had just broken free, and the car starts going in reverse fast. I guess he didn't want to hit a tree and get caught again. Then I got a full front view of it. Its wings spread wide, and it shoots straight up into the sky, and I can see it flying away. I'm wanting out of there so bad, and that's all I can keep repeating. We went to his friend's house and just waited outside for him. My boyfriend just suggested we don't even mention this to his friend. I was traumatized. I had seen many things I couldn't explain in my life, but never ever had I ever had anything come after me like that. While we're waiting on his friend to get there, I was trying to piece together what had happened. I said, I thought it was someone you knew, the way it had come over to the car, like it was going to talk to us or something. He said, I never even saw it. I said, what? Even when its wing was coming in the sunroof, with the big claw coming after us? He tells me he didn't see anything. Not even when we were backing out, and both facing and looking that way. So, I don't know what it was, and I couldn't find anything on Google Images that even remotely looked like it. So I drew a picture. It had a human-like body, and I didn't see the wings at first, and I thought it was wearing a big cape, like some kind of Halloween costume or something. It had curly black hair that came straight up off of its head from behind the extra skin, or whatever that was protruding off the top of its head. It's really hard to explain. The next day, when my boyfriend mentioned it, he showed me a scratch on his right shoulder from where I guessed the claw got him. It was only a tiny scratch, but he said it hurt to the bone. The car also had deep scratches where it mauled it. My side had a dent in it, and the back of the sunroof had deeper marks where the claw had scraped it several times. If the damage to the car and my boyfriend wasn't there to confirm it, I would have chalked it all up to having a nightmare. Many of the people I've confided in about this don't believe me, and a couple have even sort of laughed. This was like something out of a horror movie, and I've even thought of that movie Jeepers Creepers, and often wondered if it wasn't going to eat us. It's by far the most scary thing that I've ever had happen to me. I guess I blocked it out, because I haven't thought about it in a few years, but it slipped into my head last night as I was walking in the dark, and it gave me chills remembering. I hope to never see anything like that again. Once, back in the 90s, my dad's car broke down in the middle of the night. He was alone and on a back road with not a lot going on. As it happens, he broke down right near a house. It was a bit dilapidated looking, but whatever. He needed to call someone to pick him up. He walked over, knocked on the door, and an older lady answered. She was sweet and let him use the phone to call his dad. He got picked up by his dad, and the next morning they came back to tow the car. There was no house anymore, or any sign of it. As a child, I had an imaginary friend named DC. I can picture him in my head, what he looked like, even now as an adult. He was a boy covered in soot. I was attached to him, and kinda weird about it. My mom would call me to dinner and I'd say something like, DC says I'm not allowed to eat right now. My parents could also hear me playing with him and talking to him, completely acting as if he was responding to me. A bit of time passed, and I stopped mentioning him or playing with him. When my parents asked what happened, I told them that he died in a fire. A couple years back, I had a snow globe in my room. It was on a bookshelf across from my bed. I was lying in bed one night trying to fall asleep when I heard the snow globe winding itself up. I opened my eyes and looked in that direction, but I saw nothing and assumed that I had started to fall asleep and maybe it was a dream. As soon as I laid my head back down and closed my eyes, the snow globe started winding itself up again, for longer this time. I immediately got up and took the snow globe down to the basement. Years ago, my dad used an Ouija board alone. He placed his hands on the planchette asking a question, and it started to move. The planchette moved more and more aggressively, and my dad decided to stop and take his hands off. The planchette then, on its own, went in fast figure eights around the board, until eventually flying off. My mom also used an Ouija board with some friends years ago, without my dad, and when they were done, they placed the Ouija board on a dresser. Not long after, the board flew off and hit a wall. I've seen shadows out of the corner of my eye. I've smelled perfume that my deceased great-grandmother used to wear. I've seen drinking glasses move themselves. I've had items mysteriously disappear, then reappear days later in the spot that I had last left them. I've heard people walking downstairs when I know everyone is in their bedroom upstairs, and I've woken up twice now in the middle of the night to people in my bedroom. I have no doubt in my mind that in some form or another, ghosts are real. One night I was watching The Conjuring at home with my little sister when we heard someone putting a key into our front door and opening it. We were sitting in the living room next to a sliding door that was very close to the front door, so we both heard it very clearly. Now, this doesn't alarm us since we knew our dad had recently gone out to get some stuff, so we just assumed that he had returned. "Dad, you're back already?" I casually asked. There was no response. "Dad?" I asked again, thinking that he had not heard me the first time. Again, silence. At this point, I get the feeling that something isn't quite right, and I could tell by the look on my sister's face that she was quite nervous as well. I'll note that up to this point, she had spent the evening rolling her eyes at horror movie cliches, and she very rarely gets scared. We looked at each other for a moment, wondering what we should do, before we started hearing a few more scratching sounds from right outside the sliding door. I was frozen in fear by this stage. I tried one more time in a louder, but shakier voice. "Dad? Is that you?" Please respond, repeated in my head, but the silence continued. Now, at this point, I'm freaking out, and I literally jumped off the couch. My sister also abruptly gets up and started rapidly walking towards the other side of the room, which leads to the kitchen area. She later revealed to me that she was planning on grabbing a knife. She had this horrified look on her face that I hadn't seen never before. We looked at each other in nervous silence. I didn't really know what to do, and I didn't want to make any further sounds. I finally decided to walk up to the sliding door and began opening it as slowly as possible, peering into the darkness. I know, I literally became the idiot who investigates the unknown creepy noise without anything to protect myself with. When the door was finally open wide enough, I poked my head out and scanned the corridor, preparing for the worst. To my surprise, there was no one there. But what was more strange was that the front door was still completely shut. We never heard the door close. My sister and I were obviously both extremely relieved, as we were almost certain that there was an intruder inside the house. After this, I immediately went to go ask my mom, who was situated in her bedroom at the other end of the house, if it was her or whether she had noticed anything at all. She told me that she thought my dad had come home as well, as she also heard someone opening the front door. Around half an hour later, which felt like an eternity at the time, as we were still quite shaken from the incident, my dad finally arrived home and confirmed that he had not come home earlier. To this day, my sister and I still have no idea what happened that night. I was 14 years old visiting my dad in Alberta, Canada. After my parents had separated, my dad decided to live out in a small house in the woods, about a half hour away from the nearest town, off the grid. This was his dream, and he allowed me to experience it with him about every other weekend. We would go hiking, hunting, kayaking, birdwatching, you name it. We would even sometimes camp outside in the woods, and that's where I saw it. I not only saw a Bigfoot, but it was terribly close to me. My dad and I found a spot pretty deep in the brush to set up camp, and when night fell, we decided to sleep in our sleeping bags outside to watch the stars. My dad fell asleep pretty quickly, but it was a bit harder for me. I remember trying extremely hard to fall asleep that night, but to be honest, even though by that time I had been on plenty of camping trips with my dad already, I was still pretty freaked out by the forest at night. This fear kept me awake all through the night. I remember, at a certain point, when I was just starting to finally drift into sleep, I heard something come out of the trees and snapping twigs loudly as it walked on towards us. My dad was still fast asleep, and now I was basically pissing my pants. I thought some strange person was walking on towards our campsite, but as I squinted my eyes open a bit, I could see that only about 10 feet away from me was an enormous, hairy creature that stood and walked on two legs like a human would. Obviously, I wanted to scream out in fear, but I tried my best to pretend I was asleep in hopes that it would just eventually move along. I think the creature, which I now believe to be a Bigfoot, was attracted to the smell of the meat that my dad had been cooking before, and strangely, it didn't seem the least bit interested in us. It seemed more interested in just slowly walking around our campsite, presumably looking for some food that it must have thought we had. But I have to tell you that not only was I scared at the sight of that giant hairy man, but I was also sickened by the pungent and overwhelming odor that beast was emitting. Eventually, the Bigfoot seemed to get bored and disappeared into the darkness. I remember trembling in my sleeping bag and not being able to sleep the rest of the night. I didn't tell my father about it until he woke up the next morning, because I was afraid if I tried to wake him up during the night, then the creature might see us awake, or even hear us, and I was not willing to find out how it would react when it did. When I told my dad about it, he just told me it was probably a large bear walking around on its hind legs. But when I described to him that the creature was extremely human-like and walked like a person would, he chalked it up to me just either hallucinating from fear, or that I was not aware that I was dreaming. To this day, I know exactly what I saw. It was about 9 feet tall, with extremely long and matted brown hair all over its body, including its face, which to me seemed to look very human-like in a primitive sort of way. I still remember the horrible stench that made me want to vomit. That was probably the longest and most terrifying night of my life, but afterwards I've come to honor the experience, because I would come to realize that that creature was undoubtedly a Bigfoot, and I was one of the few people who got a chance to see it extremely up close. I made a throwaway to post this because people know my name, and it's kind of embarrassing. I've only told my partner because I'm definitely the type who rolls my eyes at ghost stories and holds firm on the stance that I don't believe in ghosts. And yet, I have 2 brothers and we all lived in a small house when I was about 8 to 11 years old. All of us kids hated the downstairs. It was always chilly, which is normal for a basement, but it felt like a creepy chilly. That sounds lame, I know, but my little brother, probably 6 when we first had that house, had a room downstairs and hated it. He would go so far as to not sleep in his room because he was so frightened. He wouldn't even enter the basement bathroom. He always had awful nightmares in that house, and so did I. All of us kids still refer to it as the haunted house. It sounds stupid to type, but it just truly had a bad feeling to it. Anyway, the incident. I was about 11 and downstairs alone. There was like a 45-minute gap between getting off school and when my mom got home, and my brothers weren't there. They must have been with my dad. I really can't remember. So I was on the computer, which was in the basement, and to my left is the staircase heading up, and my cat was sitting on the landing between the first set of stairs and the second. It was only about 4 p.m., so it was light out still, and I had no music playing, so there was nothing to confuse me. This next part will probably sound minor and not freaky, but I get chills thinking of it. Suddenly, I hear, "Hi, hi, 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 hi," starting as a whisper and getting progressively louder and circling the room, as though someone was running around. I might have chalked it up to me hearing something, I guess, except when the hi got to the staircase. Directly to my left, my cat arched her back and hissed loudly. I fucking bolted upstairs, my cat following me, and never went down there solo again until we moved into our next house. One afternoon I was at work. I walked past a room with a window in the door and automatically glanced in the window. There was a woman standing in the room, except there are only 3 people in the building, and the other 2 were in the office behind me. I took a couple steps, realized what I had just seen, and backed up quickly, but by the time I got back to the window, the room was empty. There was only one door, and when I opened it, the room was indeed empty. At that same building, a coworker was telling me that she was in the office right around the corner of that same room. She couldn't see the door, but she could see the shadow of the door on the floor as it slowly opened and then closed again. She was the only one in the building at the time, and she refused to check. I arrived about an hour later. She asked me to check the door. It was still locked. I worked there for about 3 years, and every single one of us had stories. We heard voices in empty rooms. Once we were sitting in the office and we heard somebody breathing in an empty corner. It was common to be in one of the rooms and think somebody had just walked into the room, only to look up and find the room was empty except for you. I had one manager who scoffed at all of our stories. She did not believe us when we told her that there was something fairly benign but creepy in the building. We were sitting in the office, and she scoffed and loudly said, "If there's anything in here, prove it." We all held our breath, kind of nervous, a bit scared but also curious. And just about the time my manager was getting that look on her face that said, "Ha, told you so," something was thrown out into the hallway. It took us all several moments to work up the courage before going to check, and finding that a book that normally sat on a bookshelf near the front door had somehow gone from that bookshelf, around the corner, and halfway down the hallway. That manager never talked about it, and quit shortly after that. I've since quit also, but last I heard, they were still hearing voices and seeing shadows in the building.